y'all get this. One of Ted's girlfriends had left a piece of jewelry in Joan and Ted's marital bed. Joan was mortified, devastated, and furious. What should she do? Forget about it, Jackie said. You can't take it personally. It's just how Kennedy men are. Joan knew that Jackie took a European approach to infidelity, but she hadn't expected this radical acceptance. Did Jackie just really sit there and take it? Hi you guys, welcome back to my channel. Today we have a wonderful new story from Ask Not, the Kennedys and the Women They Destroyed. This book by Maureen Callahan has been fascinating so far. We are at our 8th episode, which is Joan Bennett Kennedy. Now, I do want to give a little plug. I don't do this for every episode, but where there are ones where it would help you to go back to listen to another one, I do want to let you know that. So there's two things that you might want to know about. The first one you're going to want to look at is episode 7, which was about Mary Jo Kopechne, and it goes into the whole story of Ted Kennedy and Chappaquiddick and what happened that cost Mary Jo Kopechne her life. The episode right before this one was actually a bonus episode. We unwrapped this Life magazine from August 1st, 1969. So this one was also fascinating, and it gave us a look at the mood of the country as they heard about Chappaquiddick. What did they think? What did they ask? What kinds of things were they skeptical about? So if you're interested in either of those, go back and have a listen. But right now we are just gonna get right into this story. Episode 8, Joan Bennett Kennedy. She always said that this was what broke her. Not the fame or the drinking or the other women, but Chappaquiddick. That's when she gave up. That is when Joan Kennedy became a true alcoholic, a hardcore dawn to dusk drinker. Food stains on her designer blouses, broken bones and falls, once even in a gutter in Boston, rehab after rehab after rehab. Ted was an alcoholic too, and a cocaine addict, but he always pointed to Joan and her addictions as his albatross, his cross to bear. Another liability that might keep him from becoming president. When Joan was at her best and clearest, Teddy and his advisors loved putting her front and center, cover of People or any number of women's magazines, selling a story of pain and redemption while minimizing her husband's role in her misery. His lengthy absences, cruelty and neglect when he was home, his drinking, his self-pity and verbal abuse, and constant, barely concealed womanizing. He would mock her looks, even as his face and belly puffed up from the booze and his voracious eating habits. So the media followed Ted's lead. Joan was the loser, the drunk, the weak one. When Joan suffered her first miscarriage in May of 1963, Ted was nowhere to be found. 6 months later, when his brother Jack was assassinated, Ted kept Joan away from the wake in Hyannisport. Neither she nor her grief was welcome. Her exclusion was all the more painful because she really loved Jack, and she was one of the few people that he trusted with his torment after baby Patrick died 39 hours after his birth that August. This is something that was mentioned in episode 2 with Jackie, but Jackie had lost baby Patrick 39 hours after birth, so he didn't even live a full 2 days. Jack stayed by his side, and that birth and death was something that brought Jack and Jackie closer in the months before his assassination. Jack, as she was comforting him, was moved by her sincerity. He really was blessed by her ability to just let him talk and grieve, and especially because she didn't give him a bunch of platitudes. She didn't say, God must have needed him, or, well, he's with the angels now, or that Patrick was better off. You know, Jack said after one of his talks with her, she's a great girl. If only Ted felt that way. He was so cold and dismissive to her. Take a pill or something, he would tell her. This was not meant to be her life. Joan Bennett, the smart, gorgeous, blonde debutante from New York City, college educated at Manhattanville, had been bred for good things. She was a golden girl, a pageant queen, and then a Revlon spokesmodel, earning thousands upon thousands of dollars, guided by her father, who was an ad executive. Modeling had never really been her dream. She was in it for the money because it gave her independence and the ability to travel and pursue her love of piano. She thought one day she might play professionally. But the modeling did give her independence. Joan was a star in a famously unforgiving industry, never clearer than the day when she was at her agency's office with her latest beau, only to hear someone ask, "Who's that fat kid with Joan?" The fat kid was none other than Ted Kennedy. Joan hadn't known much about the Kennedys, but her father sure did, and he was interested. He was impressed. After a few phone calls and sporadic dates, when Ted asked Joan's father's permission to marry, he gave it. And getting fast-tracked into the Kennedys was like a coronation. This would be the most high-profile Kennedy wedding since Jackie married Jack in 1953. But as for the looming fame, Joan, even though she was a model, was not really built for it. She was marrying Ted in spite of his family, not because of it. She had been in love with him at first sight. He was so tall and athletic, and he had an insatiable lust for life that she was drawn to. Ted couldn't believe his luck. If he was going to follow his brothers into the White House, he had to find the perfect wife. And here she was. She was Catholic, she was respectable, she was drop-dead gorgeous, and she was a virgin. She never complained. She was willing to overlook his shortcomings, his laziness, his drinking, his unavailability, his bluster and crassness. She was a people pleaser. And she had grown up in a family that had trained her toward that very thing. For all of her wealth and beauty, she had actually been kind of a wallflower in high school. She was shy and she was happiest alone. She loved painting and reading and playing her piano. She didn't attract attention because she didn't want it. Joan was surprised when Ted Kennedy proposed. Maybe she should have known that those weekends in Hyannis were tests and that she was being submitted for Rose and Joe's approval. Get their eyes on her. Try her on for size. Like any important acquisition, make the best assessment. Is this woman going to be a liability or an asset for our family? Could she be in it for the long haul? Could she get Ted into the Oval Office? To me, this sounds like, if any of you have watched The Crown or done any reading about Princess Diana or how she and Charles got together, this reminds me of Balmoral. Did anybody else think that? It just sounds like, you know, they had Lady Diana Spencer up to this castle, Balmoral, which is kind of their own little private family retreat, and they had her up, and Prince Philip takes her shooting, and somebody else is watching this, and Margaret's trying her out with her jokes or whatever, and they're each just kind of poking and prodding and like making their assessment, like, would she be a good one to add to the mix of our family? And that's how the decision was made. And so you see how that is still playing out in the life of the British royal family, that it doesn't lead always to a happy marriage. Now, perhaps it has at various points in history. I'm not saying it couldn't. I'm not saying that there aren't people who can have an arranged marriage and have it work. But to me, this whole situation reminded me of Charles and Diana. So you guys let me know what you think. Well, Joe and Rose, as it turned out, loved her. Joan was light. She was cheerful and sunny, and Ted marveled at her disposition. Nothing gets her down, he would say. In June 1958, as soon as she graduated from Manhattanville, Ted proposed on the beach. He didn't even have a ring, but Joan said yes anyway. The announcement would be made to the media that September, and the wedding would be in November. Y'all, to me, this seems so cheap and low class. Like his family has property and connections and could certainly procure a beautiful ring. And isn't that something that you would think about before you ask the question? It's just so weird to me. Well, to her, it was all so exciting until it wasn't. She starts noticing as she's going through different decisions with the wedding that there were certain things that she just wasn't allowed to have an opinion about, like which priest was going to be the one to marry them. That was Joe's decision, not hers. Listen to this. At their engagement party, this was the first time Joan had seen Ted since he proposed in June. So this already feels off to me. Like if you're going to get engaged to somebody, why not spend more time with them or try to sneak in time? Like you feel so giddy and happy and wonderful, and that's not how this is. Well, this is the first time they've seen each other, and Ted shows up very late and hands her an unwrapped box. Inside of it was a diamond engagement ring. Ted hadn't even seen it until she opened the box. She could tell. None of this felt right to Joan. Ted was not acting like a man in love. He wasn't in the throes of a grand romance. She realizes this is a merger. I'm just in casting. The wedding old Joe was planning was out of her control, and her father was happy to play along. He was paying for sound design and Hollywood-style lighting. Her role would just be to look pretty and produce children as if she were an assembly line worker, just like Ethel. Joan would need to campaign dutifully and look the other way when it came to Ted's many, many women. Joan knew. She might have been sheltered, but she wasn't naive. Before their wedding, her friends would tell her of seeing Ted out on dates and openly kissing other women. But Joan found it too easy to blame herself. After all, she was a virgin, and she was refusing sex with Teddy until their wedding night. Meanwhile, all these young, beautiful women are throwing themselves at him. How could she complain? It went against her very upbringing. Be good. Don't cry. Don't get angry. Don't show how you feel. Ladies, don't do that. Have any of you been raised like that? To not show how you feel, to keep everything bottled inside? We're going to hear more stories like this through the book, but it can't be healthy. You know, on the one hand, self-control is a virtue, and we are not to just be an absolute channel for every feeling we feel. One helpful analogy that I've heard is that our emotions are like dashboard lights, that sometimes a dashboard light goes off and you actually just, it just went off. Something's not true. But often when a dashboard light goes off, and it goes off in a big way where you can't get it off, you need to do something. You need an oil change. You need to have a mechanic look at it. Maybe the tires are running low on pressure, whatever, but you got to do something. The dashboard light is meant to alert you, hey, something needs attention. And that can be how our emotions are. And so to have them absolutely shut off is like shutting off a gift that God has given us to evaluate the world and to understand who he is and who we are, and often the truth about who other people are as well. So it's a gift to have those. To be trained to shut those off is like cutting off a hand. It's like, no, this is a tool for our use, and it doesn't mean you have to constantly be using it or only be at its mercy, but to not have them at all is dysfunctional. It robs you of the ability to make judgments and self-determinations that you need to make in order to move forward in life at peace. Marrying Ted was feeling like a smack in the face. Joan barely knew him, but what she was learning, she did not much like. She wasn't so sure that she wanted him or the life that came with him anymore. He hadn't even spent any time getting to know her. She simply ticked the right boxes and came along at the right time. She was only 22. Was being Mrs. Ted Kennedy worth it? She wanted to stop the wedding. Maybe not call it off exactly, but at least postpone. And not to belabor the Diana point, but I do remember hearing that Diana had actually felt this same way, that I believe it was that Charles had spent either the night before their wedding or maybe a couple of days before their wedding with Camilla, and that Diana found out about it and was just brokenhearted and cried and cried and cried and cried and almost called off their wedding. I'm not 100% sure that's true. If you want to share in the comments, if you know more about that, I'd be interested to know if I'm accurate about that. But this kind of feeling like, I don't know if this is right, is a big deal. And, you know, to bring that to a larger point, I do think that if you or someone you know is coming up to the point of your wedding and you're having big red alarm bells going off in your brain, those things are things that we're meant to listen to. This kind of riffs on the earlier point, but not that we just live as a channel for any emotion that comes out of any place, but that when there's something that's repeatedly going, you know, this guy has an anger problem, or this woman is controlling and manipulative, or whatever it is, when we have those red flags going off right before we're about to make a lifelong commitment, yes, there's a guest list. Yes, there's expenses involved. However, this is our whole life we're thinking about. And so, you know, if we're talking to others, we ought to be willing to talk through doubt and not be scared of it and not hush it up so that the show can go on. Well, they hush it up and the show goes on. In fact, here's what happens. She ends up, just like a lot of women in her class and station would have done, talking to her father. And her father goes straight to Joe and Ted. It did not go as she had hoped. They're not going to write in the papers that my son has been tossed over, old Joe thundered. This wedding is going to happen whether Ted or Joan like it or not. I think it's really interesting that he said Ted or Joan. They're embedded in there might be that Ted had already been talking to him like, I'm not sure about this, Dad. Well, this wedding was not about Ted. It was not about Joan. It was about old Joe. Her father would not defy Joe Kennedy. That was that. So the wedding was grand. The bride looked beautiful, and the newlyweds made the front page of the New York Daily News. The groom did not so much as touch his bride during the reception. Off they went on their honeymoon to a lush and secluded spot in the Bahamas, and for the first few days it felt like paradise. But then one night, Ted suddenly leapt up out of bed and began packing. He had to leave. He had an essay due for law school that he had totally forgotten about, and he had to catch a flight home immediately. Joan begins to cry. She knows this is a lazy excuse, and she's brokenhearted. Not long after that, Joan was watching a film of their wedding, and all the principals in the wedding had little microphones. And this is how she hears Jack, her brother-in-law, JFK, whisper some last-minute advice to Ted. Getting married, Jack said, didn't mean Ted had to give up sleeping with other women. Despite this, Joan actually really likes Jack, which I would not, but Joan really likes him, and Jack instantly likes her too. He nicknamed her the Dish, and she didn't feel minimized by it. She started to sense that other people were proud of her beauty, and she began feeling proud of her beauty too. She started to see her beauty as a form of currency and power that she had, that she could walk into a room and shine. In the early days of her marriage, Joan had gone to lunch with Jackie in DC to some fancy French restaurant that Jackie loved. Joan got excited and she felt that she would look her most stylish. So she gets all dolled up and walks into the restaurant. Jackie is sitting there in a simple white shift dress, flipping through the latest copy of Paris Match with minimal makeup. Joan is walking in with cascading pageant hair and a hot pink mini skirt. Her effort to impress is like screaming at everyone in the restaurant. Joan realizes, I'm tacky, but Jackie is elegant and understated. Well, it didn't matter. Joan was not there in a spirit of competition or rivalry. She came for Jackie's input. y'all get this. One of Ted's girlfriends had left a piece of jewelry in Joan and Ted's marital bed. Joan was mortified, devastated, and furious. What should she do? Forget about it, Jackie said. You can't take it personally. It's just how Kennedy men are. Joan knew that Jackie took a European approach to infidelity, but she hadn't expected this radical acceptance. Did Jackie just really sit there and take it? Frankly, Jackie said, their behavior makes me sick. Maybe that was how Jackie made her peace with it. It wasn't just Jack, and it wasn't Jackie's fault, just as it wasn't Joan's. This was a pathology passed down from the father, a kind of negative life force, this treatment of women as accessories, broodmares, chattel. It was in the Kennedy DNA, and there did not seem to be a cure. Focus on yourself, Joan, and your kids. Forget Teddy. In the early days of their marriage, Joan had been happy. She and Ted were not just sexually compatible, but her kindness and decency and sensitivity to his needs brought out a softer side of Ted. The Ted who had been teased by his siblings for being overweight was in Joan's eyes rugged and athletic. She thought he was the handsomest Kennedy brother. Only Joan was allowed to see in Ted the little boy that had been traumatized by his big sister Rosemary's disappearance. He intuited that his troubles with reading and with writing, the academic struggles that he had, were dangerously similar to Rosemary's. If he failed to please his parents, might he be made to disappear also? As Ted grows up, they send him off to boarding school, and Joe is still responding to his letters, not with responses, but with critiques of his penmanship and his weight. Joan sees why he's afraid of the old man. And soon after their daughter Kara was born in February 1960, Joan brought up a novel idea. What if we moved to California? Teddy wouldn't have to be the pinnacle of his father's hopes and dreams coming to life. Joe Jr. had already died trying to please their father. Jack was the star, the favorite son. Bobby had dutifully taken second place to Jack. So Joan thinks, wouldn't it be okay for this youngest son who doesn't have the brains or grit or self-discipline of the others to just go and have his own life? Ted loves this idea, and he loved that Joan was wary of becoming totally subsumed by his family. He thought it was wise, and he loved that she wanted what he wanted, for him to rise or fall on his own merits. And he also loved that even if he failed, she would be okay with that. The idea that Ted could take his little family 3,000 miles away was a completely new thought to him. See, he hadn't individuated at all. At no point in this family's life was he encouraged, what are you made for? How are you formed as a person? What unique skills, abilities, interests, resources do you have as a person that might give us a hint as to your direction in life? And how can we best support that? And that was not the question at all. It was all about Joe, his wishes for the family, and Teddy needed to fit into that. But there's this little window right here that Joan opens up, right? She's opened up this window, and Teddy can just barely look through it and see, like, oh, there could be a life over there 3,000 miles away. That's kind of interesting to me. Wonder if I could. And Jack Kennedy also thinks this could be a good idea. He went to bat for them and said, let Teddy live his own life. He doesn't want any of this. He wants a quiet, more private existence. He and Joan should be able to have that. But Joe was furious. California was out of the question. Ted and Joan weren't even to think about moving out of Massachusetts because Joe had a plan. Ted needed to run for one of Massachusetts' U.S. Senate seats, and he needed to win. I bought that seat, Joe said. It belongs to the Kennedys. No matter that Joe had 3 other daughters, or that Jack thought his sister Eunice could have been the most thoughtful and naturally gifted politician of them all. The boys were the ones bred for power, not the girls. The boys were the ones to have world domination. So Ted surrenders. The window is shut. The decision sets the tone for the rest of their marriage. Joan would never come first. Yet now he needs her, because as Ted's Senate campaign begins in the summer of 1961, Ted was polling more favorably among women than men, and Joan was one of the big reasons why. Whereas Jackie was kind of cool and aloof and had this strange, airy way of talking, Joan was down to earth. She would sometimes give interviews that let loose of some of her insecurities, and it endeared her to women. They thought she had a lot of candor and kindness. One time she let it slip that the First Lady sometimes wore wigs, and Joan really beat herself up over this, and Ted did too. Jack and Jackie were the stars, and everyone else's job was to prop them up. "What is wrong with you?" Ted raged. "Are you crazy?" He didn't stand up for her, defend her. And he was not trying to help her learn how to be a good Kennedy wife. She just was yelled at. Now, Ted was happy to show her off at parties or on the pages of women's magazines if it would help his career. And right now it was helping his career. She was his best asset. In private, though, he was neglecting her. Every now and then he would need her, like he'd call in the middle of the afternoon and say, "Hey, I'm bringing like 10 colleagues home for dinner and you need to pull off an elegant multi-course meal. Don't embarrass me, Jonesy," he'd say. Again, we see the echoing of the same feelings that Mary and Carolyn have felt also. Does anybody understand how terrifying it is to be told you have to be perfect all the time? Some days she's so depressed she can barely get out of bed. Despite the fact that he was becoming more and more famous, her husband's womanizing is getting worse and worse. After he wins that Senate seat, due in large part to Joan's help, he walks into a royal dinner in Belgium with a sex worker on his arm. They were both drunk, completely hammered, and Ted made a terrible spectacle. He made out with this woman on an antique sofa, and then one of them, in their total inebriation, urinates on the couch. Joan was so mortified back in America that she wrote a note to the party's hosts apologizing for her husband. Now, I just want to say, there is a way to be a helper and a servant and a kind-hearted person toward your husband, especially if he's pursuing things that are in the good of the family. However, if you actually think it's in the country's best interest or in a company's best interest, you still don't have to take his lumps for him. Like, this terrible decision on his part, he should have had to own it. I could see, even as a wife, saying, "You are going to bear this alone, write the letter, and then we need to have a talk." I mean, I wouldn't be in a marriage like this where he's doing this, but even if he had made some other like non-adulterous error in a very public and humiliating place, still, she shouldn't be the one writing the letter. I could totally see as a wife saying, "Hey, you need to make that right, because that was really not okay." But she writes the letter. She begins having all sorts of health problems, which makes sense. She's got stomach pains that cause the doctors to do exploratory surgery because they wonder if there's something going on. They found nothing. Then comes the plane crash. About 7 months after JFK's assassination, Ted had been flying from DC to Springfield, Massachusetts, where he would be named the Democratic nominee for the U.S. Senate. Just after midnight, Joan Kennedy was resting her eyes and waiting for him to arrive when there's a knock at the door. It's one of the Kennedy family chauffeurs. He takes her to the hospital. She's wondering, how bad is it? Well, it was bad. The plane had crashed into an apple orchard in Massachusetts, and Ted had been dragged out of the wreckage by a fellow passenger. A Good Samaritan comes along, and Ted is paralyzed from the waist down. He's close to the plane, and so this Samaritan calls the police and fire departments, grabs blankets and water, and hurries back to the crash site to wait with Ted until the ambulance came. This probably saved his life. Inside the plane, the pilot and one of Ted's aides were already dead. Ted's back was broken. 2 of his ribs were broken, and he had a collapsed lung. By the time rescue crews got to him, he had no pulse. This was serious. So she gets to the emergency room and realizes her husband might not make it. Her aides secure the room right next to hers so that she can be there with him. And he's under an oxygen tent, getting a blood transfusion. It's unclear if he'll live through the night. But she keeps calm. She tells the aides, I talked to him and he said he'll be all right. By Sunday, he's stable enough for surgery, and he had a 6-hour spinal operation that, if successful, would save him from a life of being a paraplegic. Ted's recovery, she was told, would take anywhere from 6 months to a year. She is stronger than the Kennedys give her credit for, because she's had a miscarriage about a year ago. Jack died, and now this. The advisors come to Joan asking her to stump for Ted. She hated retail politics. She was an introvert, but she didn't think twice. Of course I will, she said. No self-doubt, no anger, no question. All their problems as a married couple were completely minimalized. Ted had lived, and so she was going to do this for him. He's in rehab, and she has 3 small children at home. She gave birth to Teddy Jr. in 1961. So every morning, though, y'all, she is rising up. She goes an hour in and would meet with Ted in the hospital as he's strapped face down in an orthopedic bed. She would sit with him as if nothing had happened. She would hold speeches and her itinerary and talk through the talking points that she might make. She brought newspapers and books, and she laughed when he joked that he was rotated like a rotisserie chicken. They were trying to keep his lungs from building up fluid. And then she'd have a quick bite with him and head out for her campaign stops. I did think, at least he doesn't have a pinup of Marilyn in the room, right? At least there's been a little bit of progress over maybe these 10 years or so between these 2 hospital stays, between his big brother Jack and Teddy. 6 days a week, 8 hours a day, through cities and towns, meet and greets, polka dancing, fielding questions from reporters about Ted. This is what she's doing. She is running the campaign for him. She didn't just do a good job, she did a great job, and she was more popular than her husband. At the same time, she was an introvert, and these things began to weigh on her. She finds herself drinking more frequently. She feels depleted at the end of a day. She starts focusing on all the things she got wrong, and even while the team is telling her, you're doing a great job, you've really carried this campaign along, she is still in a doom spiral. Maureen Callahan tells us it's really more due to the fact that Ted didn't seem to care. Well, he wins, and he wins in a landslide. With 75% of the vote. This was a record victory in Massachusetts. And so all the Kennedys are super fans of Joan. Jackie writes her a congratulatory letter. Ethel calls and lavishes her with praise. Joan even heard Bobby had told Ted that his reelection was due to her. Her mother-in-law, Rose, sends her 2 bouquets of red roses in congratulations and gratitude. The only one who never said a thing, not so much as a thank you, was Ted. Y'all, he is such a big baby. We already saw this in the Chappaquiddick episode where he's like muttering and laying on the ground and hopeless and whining about things. He is so resentful. She's done all this work at great personal cost because she has little kids. And, you know, for those of us who are mothers, you know you don't get those years back. You want that time with your little people, and they're so darling, and there's so much that's happening in those early years, and yet she set all those things aside for him. She's driving in. Have any of you had an hour-long commute? It's exhausting. She's doing all this. She's got little kids. She's got an hour commute. She's campaigning, and she's an introvert, and she's done it all for him. Not a thank you. He's such a selfish baby. Now we're fast forwarding to July of 1969. Joan is on doctor-ordered bed rest. She's pregnant and at risk of miscarrying for the 3rd time. She hears this influx of voices come into her home. Her husband's voice is among them. He had already been away for the weekend, and he'd left Joan alone on the Cape with their small children. She thinks maybe she'll get up and ask all these people to leave. She's tired. It makes sense. But someone had been dispatched to her bedroom and told her to stay right where she was. Something was wrong. She reaches over to the bedside table and picks up the phone, and her husband is on the line, talking to another woman. Helga, the girlfriend. Well, this was one of them anyway. What they were talking about, Joan didn't understand, but clearly Helga already was fluid in the topic, and Ted and Helga are talking back and forth. He's in a panic, talking about a car accident he had been in out on the vineyard. Something about leaving the scene and blacking out and wondering what he should do. Whatever this was, Joan realizes this is going to be my problem too. How awful is this? You think about all the details that Ms. Callahan has given us, that she's in danger of a miscarriage. She's on doctor-ordered bed rest. Just that is stress enough. She's been left for the entire weekend in that state with her small children. That's stressful. A bunch of guests walk in and start making noise, which I would hate. Wouldn't want to hear that when I'm laid up in bed on bed rest. I don't want to have a whole heap of people in my house. It's probably a mess because I've been home all weekend with the little kids. Even if she has a nanny, even if she has a housekeeper, you don't want people in your home when you're feeling terrible and anxious about a baby. And then to pick up the phone and hear Ted on the phone with the love of his life, which is how it was described last chapter, Helga. It'd be so humiliating. It'd be so infuriating. And she knows she's going to be stuck with this problem. So he's talking to his stupid girlfriend about this whole problem, but she's going to be the one who has to live with it. She would be called on to save him yet again. In the 11 years since they had been married, she had become not so much a wife as a professional, reputational shield. Someone he could hide behind with beauty and candor and warmth. After all, his aides thought, if a woman as good as Joan loved and stood by Ted Kennedy, then how bad could he really be? And the answer was, Ted was worse than anybody even knew. In the weeks after Mary Jo Kopechne's death, Ted had jetted off to Paris, where his sister Eunice and her husband Sarge were doing a special promotion of the Special Olympics in honor of Rosemary Kennedy. So you'd think, okay, Ted's trying to do some reputational repair, right? He's there trying to do good and get the focus off of the girl he left in the car and show what a good, volunteer he is for this meaningful cause. Nope. Word gets back that Ted had been frequently wandering around the ambassador's residence, drunk and naked. As different advisors to Ted Kennedy began talking about this, one says, what Teddy ought to do is resign from the Senate and take a year or two to do some good work, to redeem himself, to suggest that night at Chappaquiddick was just an aberration. An economist who was advising him is like, you've got to be kidding. We are not dealing with a moral animal. We are dealing with a political animal. They all have this plan to re-elect Ted despite his behavior. That same drive to get him reelected was what got Joan up out of bed, off of bed rest, to go along with Ted to Mary Jo's funeral. She was by his side as he wore that stupid neck brace that he did not need. The political animal decided to announce Joan's pregnancy on July 25th, just before making his address to the nation about Mary Jo. And then 2 days after the accident, Ted was the one who had pressured Joan into calling Mary Jo's parents. A young woman's death had been caused by her husband, yet all these men in suits, all these Kennedy women too, were concerned with only one thing: saving Ted's career. It didn't matter that Joan was really hurting for Mary Jo, for their children, and for herself. It didn't matter. They were all determined to get Ted, lazy, drunk, horny, feckless, remorseless Ted, into the White House. So Ted's being nice to her now, I bet. He and his aides are talking to her like she's dumb rather than in shock. "We need you to pull this off," they said. "If the Kopechneys like you, they'll go easier on Ted. They won't push for criminal charges and they won't sue. They won't bankrupt you and your young family." Joan knew better that none of them cared about Mary Jo Kopechne. She was just another inconvenient woman to be managed and disposed of. But a number was dialed, and Mary Jo's mother picked up. "Hello, Miss Kopechne," Joan said. "This is Joan Kennedy, Ted's wife." Mary Jo's mother said hi back. She didn't sound angry. "We are so sorry about what happened," Joan said. "The whole Kennedy family. We've had tragedy ourselves, and so we empathize with you, and we are so sorry." Mary Jo's mother was weeping softly, and Joan looks up. The men in suits look exultant. Ted looked relieved, happy almost. 1 month later, just 6 days before the inquest into Mary Jo's death, Joan miscarried. This would have been her 4th child. It was one that she badly wanted. Ted was away camping with 2 of their children, and it was Ethel that had taken Joan to the emergency room. When Teddy rushed back, Joan did not want to see him. That was it for her. That was the moment that she had given up. Chappaquiddick, Mary Jo's funeral, the phone call to Mrs. Kopechne, the inquest, all of it had contributed, she felt, to this miscarriage. Ted made her lose her baby. That is when she said she truly became an alcoholic. It's also when she becomes the object of Teddy's scorn. At his most vile, after coming home late and gorging on leftovers, this is how she knows that he's having an affair, because she knows he likes to be a glutton after sex. So he comes home, he's ravenous, he's eating in the kitchen, just a bottomless pit of gluttony, it says. Then he would just dismiss her as a drunk, terrible mother who slept all day. Weak. That was his favorite insult. Ted, of course, held on to his Senate seat after leaving Mary Jo in that car. How? Well, he leaned really heavily on his wife and his 3 dead brothers. And all was forgiven. Joan, on the other hand, her life was becoming tabloid fodder, something for bored housewives to consume while they waited in the grocery store line. The Joan Kennedy story, from dream to nightmare. Unlike so many headlines about her, that one was actually true. November comes to hold new memories for Joan. It was early that month in 1973 that their youngest son, then 12-year-old Teddy, sweet, shy, obedient Teddy, complained of pain in his right leg in the lower part where a raised bruise had formed. Doctors quickly find out that he has a rare form of cancer. It's an extremely malignant tumor at great risk of metastasizing quickly. And so the doctors tell Joan and Ted that the only option is to amputate the leg above the knee immediately. So early on the morning of November 18th, just days before the 10th anniversary of Jack's assassination, Teddy Jr. underwent a 4-hour surgery at Georgetown University Hospital. And when he wakes up, both parents are sitting there in his hospital room, putting on a happy, united front and making sure their boy knew he was going to be okay. For Joan, this is a crisis that solders her to her husband's side. Before Teddy Jr. had this diagnosis, she and Ted had been on the verge of separation. She had spent the summer traveling in Europe, but now there's no way they can divorce. She realizes she'll look like a terrible mother, and Ted's eventual run for president would be completely compromised. Just like Mary Jo's death and the phone call afterwards made it to where she was tied to this marriage, this is the same sort of crisis that connects her irrevocably to Ted. Now, for most of us, we would say, well, marriage is meant to be an irrevocable bond, but Teddy has already broken the bond many times over. He's broken her heart, he's broken her body and her spirit. And so she's thinking of getting a divorce, but these crises keep her glued to him despite the unhealth of their marriage. The unintended consequence for Joan, it says, she was now a Kennedy for life. So that is the end of this chapter. I wanted to ask you guys a few things. First, what did you think about the similarity to Charles and Diana? I'd be interested to hear. Did you have that same hopeful moment with the idea of this life in California? And do you think that would have worked? Have you seen that work in real life? And then the way these tragedies roped her in and kind of kept her tied to him. What did you think of that? I do think that often in a good marriage, crisis can bring us together. But it was kind of sad to see that in this situation, it brings them together, but in a fake way. It's not like it actually, I think with Jack and Jackie, the death of baby Patrick did bring them closer together, and they kept that closeness to the end of his life. But it seems like this closeness was kind of like a faux closeness, like they're just pretending in the hospital room. So what did you think? The last thing I want to ask you guys is if you have any book ideas for the next thing we should read, I would love to hear them. This book has been fantastic. It's been very interesting, very easy to read through, very easy to talk about. And so I would love if you have other ideas, whether it's about Kennedy, whether it's about some other family dynasty, whether there's a political angle or otherwise. I have some ideas. I'd love to hear your ideas. So please leave those in the comments. That would really help me as I think through where we're headed next. So you guys have a great day. I am greatly loving this time with you, and I hope you are too. Bye-bye.